Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session in which we will be discussing the role of diets for improvement of human and planetary health. My name is João. I lead the food practice at WWF. Let me just do a quick recap for those of you who weren't able to attend the previous sessions, just to frame the context for this upcoming session. Up to this point, our discussions revolved around the triple challenge of achieving food security, limiting climate change, and creating a safe operating space for nature. We have discussed the fact that the food system uses an immense amount of natural resources and causes huge environmental impacts. So the system is clearly not working for the planet. But that's not all, though. Approximately 821 million people are hungry every day, while 2 billion are either obese or overweight. In fact, diets are the leading cause of non-communicable diseases such as diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So the food system is not working well for people either. And what's most unbelievable to me is that this happens while 1/3 of all food produced is either wasted or lost along the supply chain. To frame this session, very often when we think about food, we tend to approach it from two seemingly separate sides. The production side that impacts nature, climate, planetary health, in summary, and from the consumption side that impacts human health. In this session, we will do something different. We will look into how consumption, that is, how our dietary choices, could improve human health, planetary health, and sustain livelihoods, all at the same time. This is the challenge. And we will discuss with experts what we can do about that, especially at the local level. So in the next hour, we will hear a short presentation to frame our discussion. Then we will have invited 4 experts to share their views on nutrition, environment, women pastoralists, communities, and since we're talking about food, we did not forget to invite an amazing chef to share her views. I'll introduce them later, but you can find their names and bios in the chat box. Please use the Q&A section of the Whova platform to ask your questions, or you can vote for the questions that you find are most interesting to be responded by the panel. If you'd like to ask your question to a specific panelist, please put their name before you ask the question. You'll also be hearing in the chat box from Peter McFeely, who is our comms lead, and he will also be sending information to you. It is now my pleasure to introduce Brent Logan, who is food science lead at WWF, to give a short presentation to frame our discussion. Brent, let me go to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Al. So let me just switch and share my screen, got a presentation for everybody. All right. Yeah, thank you, Zhao. It's a great honor to be here and to be talking about food and to be pivoting. The last 3 hours, we've been talking about the triple challenge, and in this session to pivot and to talk more about how diets and healthy diets can have a huge impact. Now, let me first start off by talking about what we know. And I think everybody watching here knows these facts. You know, we know that the climate is changing. We know that the earth is getting warmer. We've seen scenes like this play out in different parts of the world where the Arctic is melting at rates that we haven't seen before. We also know that last year we saw fires in various areas of the world that had devastating consequences. We know that we're losing species at rates that we haven't seen for the last couple million years. You know, and I used to work in Borneo, and I saw firsthand the devastating consequences that this had. We also know that we're facing a growing obesity epidemic that is sweeping the planet and is making people a lot less healthy in many areas of the world. These are the things that we know. But what don't we know? And I want to switch and talk about the role that food play. And it might be less obvious to us in terms of directly tying that connection between the issues that I talked about previously with food. Now, when we think about diets, it might be a bit more obvious that the food that we consume probably has a direct impact on our health. and that if we're putting bad stuff into our mouths, it could have negative consequences on us. That connection might be a bit more obvious, but what might be a bit less obvious is the direct role that food plays in environmental degradation. Whether we're talking about biodiversity loss, water use, land system change, or also greenhouse gas emissions. And for this presentation, although food has a large impact on all of those areas, I want to focus specifically on food and a stable climate, which is one of the pillars of the triple challenge that we've been talking about for the last 3 hours. Now, when we are talking about climate change, I think a lot of us tend to think about, okay, well, climate change is about electricity, or it's about buildings and transportation and industry, and that's where the problem lies. And that is absolutely correct. It's 76% of the problem, and we have to decarbonize all of those sectors. But what we tend to forget about is the role that food plays. The food that we consume, how we produce it, and the land that we're using for it. And that consumes about 24% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So that's 24% of the problem, and also 24% of the actual solution. So we cannot forget about that 24%, and it's time that we as a global community need to start realizing that food is central to helping us to achieve Paris. But are we even close? Are we on the right track to actually achieving Paris? And the short answer is, well, no. If we continue with current consumption patterns globally with a shift towards more animal source foods, what we'll see is that global food emissions will double by 2050. And what you see here in this graph is 2020. You can see emissions at about 5.6 gigatons, just slightly above the planetary boundary for food. And if we continue to consume in the habits that we have been, and that's translated to various countries in different parts of the world, what we'll see is that emissions will double. And this will create a emissions gap of about 4.8 gigatons. And what's so dangerously scary about this is the fact that our window of opportunity, or our chances for success with achieving Paris, is so narrow. So any increase will hurt our chances of actually doing it. So what we need to do is we need to figure out how do we actually bend this curve downwards and get it to within the planetary boundary for food, while still adding 2 billion more people to the planet. So what's one of the key levers for bending it down? And it is dietary shifts. And if you look at the impact of various food groups on environmental impacts or on health, you'll see that certain foods, such as red meat and also processed meat, do have higher environmental impacts than other food groups, such as whole grains, vegetables, fruits, and others. So you can start to see if we start to have a diet which is a bit more balanced and has a higher proportion of plant-based foods, then we can start to improve our health and decrease our environmental impact. But a lot of the things that we've been talking about, we're talking about global targets, we're talking about global implementation, we're talking about global issues. But and it's important to understand the connection between global issues and the global food system and what happens on the ground. But any action that we implement has to be understood of the implications that it'll have in countries and also various with various peoples in different parts of the world, because it will play out differently. And it's at the local level where this will actually take place and where actions will happen. And let's just look at how understanding the local context is so important by looking at current consumption intakes in different parts of the world. We talk about the need for a dietary shift, but what does that dietary shift look like in different areas? Well, if you look at North America here, you can see that compared to an optimal intake level, which is this orange dashed line, you can see that North Americans are consuming about 638% above what they should be from a health intake when we're looking at red meat, 268% for eggs, 230% for chicken. So over consumption of certain food groups. Whereas if you look at other parts of the world, sub-Saharan Africa, you see a very different picture here playing out of underconsumption of many food groups except starchy vegetables. Southeast Asia looks similar as well, underconsumption of almost everything. So what we're seeing play out globally is this imbalance in food, where certain parts of the world are eating too much, they're over-consuming certain foods, other parts of the world are not consuming enough, and we have to figure out how we shift and balance this global consumption of food so that we're all eating healthy levels of the right foods at the right levels, and doing it within the planetary boundary food. And the good thing about it is we can actually do that. but we're not going to be able to do it without that global shift and being able to look at the local and regional nuances, which we will discuss more on this panel. When we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions, it's a very similar picture. The impact does not play out the same in every single country. This is per capita emissions of G20 countries, looking at the food emissions only. And you see that even within this block of countries, emissions are not the same. They're not equal. You have certain countries like Australia and Argentina and Brazil, which have high per capita emissions, where other countries like Indonesia, India, Japan, and Turkey have much lower rates. So even within the block of countries like the G20, which have to lead on a dietary shift, not all countries can be treated the same, and some countries are going to have to implement much more ambitious targets than others. I think all of us, you know, we're here at this forum, we're thinking about these issues, and I think all of us want to try and figure out what we can do to make the world a better place. We want to think about, you know, what we can do to solve climate change and biodiversity loss and all these big global issues. But oftentimes it's hard to connect to them, and it's hard to know exactly what action we can do and what action we can take that will make that big change. The great thing about food is it actually empowers us. It gives a power 3 times every single day. The food choices that we make has a direct impact on climate change, biodiversity loss, global equality issues, and many other issues as well. So really the power is on your plate if you want to make a difference. And with that, I look forward to an exciting discussion with all of you. Thank you, Zhao.
Brent, thank you very much. I think it's time now for the panelists to light up their screens, if you will, so people can see who you are. And I will introduce you as soon as you come live. Thank you. Let me introduce the other panelists to the audience who will join Brent and me for an enlightened discussion. First, we have Lawrence Haddad. Lawrence is the Executive Director of GAIN, the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. We have Lucy Mulenki. Lucy, please light up your screen so we can see you. Thank you. Lucy is Executive Director of the Indigenous Information Network. And this panel would not be complete without Mega Colley. Mega, can you light up your screen if you haven't yet? Mega was nominated as the best chef in India. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. Their bios should be in the chat box in the Whova platform. Let me ask the first question to warm us up to Lawrence. Lawrence, Brent said that food is central for us to achieve Paris. And coming from an environmental organization, we hear a very seductive message that, you know, when it comes to diets, one should eat more plant-based foods and less animal-sourced foods if we want to be healthy and save the planet. Do you find that message seductive? And are there nuances that we should be hearing from where you sit in this debate? Over to you.
Thank you, Zhao, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody on the line. And thank you, Brent, for a really nice presentation. You know, it is a seductive question and a seductive message, but when I was listening to Brent's presentation, I was reminded of my old professor who used to say, averages are deceiving. So at the global level, that message works really quite well. But, you know, if you stick your head in the oven and your feet in the refrigerator, you're probably okay on average, but you're not doing very well. So averages don't tell the whole story. So where people are eating a lot of meat and animal source foods, high levels of that, they should reduce the consumption of that, because that is going to be good for their own health and it's going to be good for the planet's health. But there are millions of people who are not eating enough animal source food. They need it to get the vitamins and minerals that they need to grow properly. They're eating day after day, they're eating cereals, roots, and tubers, and that's it. 3 times, if they're lucky, 3 times a day, 7 times a week. What they need is some extra diversity of food. Statistic in Africa, 20% of kids, only 20% of young kids get a minimum diet diversity. Only 20%. These are UNICEF stats. So if you're eating a lot of animal source foods and especially red meats, eat less. But many people need to eat more. Now, For the greenhouse gas emission story, I'm not an expert, but I do know that we know that some animal production systems are much more. You get a lot more edible content per greenhouse gas unit emitted than you do for others, and most of the more inefficient animals production systems are in the low-income countries. So the low-income countries need to become more efficient at producing animal source food. So having smaller herd sizes to service a growing population, that's totally feasible, but that depends on technology. That will reduce greenhouse gas emission per unit of food consumed. So that's a way of offsetting that. But so it's a very nuanced picture. And when I could make it more nuanced by bringing in animal health and livelihoods as well. Over.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. Yeah, I like the point you made about averages don't tell the whole story. It's definitely true. So, when we go beyond these averages, there is the message that, food consumption and diets will mean different things in different parts of the world. So let me shift now to Lucy and see how this narrative plays out from where she stands. Lucy, Lawrence mentioned the need for animal production systems to be made more efficient and that different parts of the world need different things. How does this message play to you, who works with pastoralists and pastoralist communities, and especially women?
Thank you. I have a little bit of problem with my internet, but I'll try my best to answer, and I hope I don't fade away. I think it's very important what, especially the presentation, which has we watched, and also the discussion that has started. And I must say that life is a bit different for the pastoralists, nomadic pastoralists, and also the women, especially whom we work with, and who also are the main people who produce food. As we know that many of the pastoralists, we are all set up in a traditional way, and the life still goes the same. Women are the main producers. And looking at the trend, the way it's going, some years back, pastoralists depended only on livestock, on meat, only one kind of food for that matter. And also that depended on the areas where they are. Right now, we have had a shift in the past few years where we are trying to get the pastoralists also changing and having other alternatives in order to be able to have that food which they can be able to, which can help them in their bodies and also in their health, because meat alone is no longer enough and it's not even available. And also, if you talk about the milk that was traditional food for most of them is no longer also available. And this is all because the whole system in the world is changing. I think as we discuss these things, we should also look at the way the whole system is changing. Looking at the food which was on the table there is something that most of the communities would love to grow and be able to produce that. But as we say, the whole system is different and changing, and the best that we could do is to have the communities learn this and be able to get that a kind of production of food. At the same time, you can't also say that the markets are there. But if I just talk about the past few 6 months, 3 months ago, the whole production has gone up, has gone down. And we're actually fearing for the health and nutrition of most of the communities because of not getting the right kind of food that they're supposed to have and the nutrition that they're supposed to have as communities. And as we know that there are quite a number of systems that are promoted, and also that the governments try as much as possible to make sure that we have food. But it also focuses mainly on large scale farming, which doesn't focus much on the communities. And that's where we really want to see that we can discuss much more and look at that remote rural community. And also of course, there are people who will also look at the urban centers and so on. So that's one of the biggest challenge that we face as pastoralists, considering on the way of life, the traditions and so on.
Lucy, one follow-up question for you. What is the role of women and the importance of women in this production system? If you can frame that, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Is anybody hear me talk? Or
Yeah.
was I lost?
No, we can hear you well. Did you hear the question?
Okay.
Yeah, I think Lucy's having a little bit of an issue with the internet sound. So this is fine. We can come back to that question in a minute. What Lucy presented to us is that the systems that she works with is ever evolving. And now I'd like to ask a question to Brent in light of what Lucy just said. In your presentation, Brent, you mentioned a carbon budget. Isn't it true that global food emissions need to go to zero to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees? And how can we achieve this at the country level while also encouraging systems like the ones that Lucy discussed with us?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Yeah, interesting thing about food systems is it functions a bit differently from the other sectors. You know, and it's true with the other sectors. If you're looking at electricity, if you're looking at transportation, buildings, we have to decarbonize all of those by 2050. We have to essentially get down to zero. But with food, anywhere that we cut it, we're going to have to produce food for people. We're going to have to, we're always going to have cows. We're always going to have to till the soil. We're always going to have to apply some level of fertilizer. And with that, there's always going to be some level of residual emissions within food. What we found that like we don't believe that it will be possible to completely bring the food sector emissions down to zero. And therefore we've allocated it to be like a carbon budget of about 5 gigatons. So that what we essentially have is a 5 gigaton budget that we have to allocate to every single person on this planet. Every single country has to work within that carbon budget. Now, what is happening today is that a small group of countries, mainly G20 countries, are consuming and using most of that budget. And they're doing it at the expense of everybody else. And if we want, if we truly take the global inequality crisis seriously, and if we truly believe that every single person on this planet has a right to healthy, sustainable food, then we're going to have to start dealing with this imbalance in how we're currently using these food emissions. And that's going to be an issue that we have to start tackling going forward. What that is going to mean is that certain parts of the world, certain countries are going to have to decrease their emissions much more rapidly than others. And we're going to have a global balancing of this, and that's going to be one of the only ways that we can do it going forward. And it will look out and it will play differently in various parts of the world. Thanks,
Brent. Do you think, I know that you're doing current research on national dietary guidelines and looking at them. Do you think that there is a role for national dietary guidelines to incorporate environmental criteria and that can play both to improve human health and planetary health?
Yeah, I would say that national dietary guidelines are a very important policy tool, but they're only one part of the picture. And when you look at current trends in national dietary guidelines, they are trending in the right direction. I mean, Canada just launched their new guidelines last year, which are very good. Sweden and other areas. I mean, many parts of the world, there is an overall trend towards promoting more plant-based diets. Where one of the real issues is that the environment is still not considered strongly enough in these national dietary guidelines. That's something that we're going to have to fix. And there's a large disparity between implementation, what we're recommending, and what is actually happening on the ground. And it's that large gap we're going to have to figure out what are the sticky points in the system that we have to unstick in order to make it happen? What are the policies that are currently in place that are not allowing or not enabling the conditions for people to be able to eat these healthy diets that I think we all want to eat?
Very good. Thanks a lot, Brent. Let me shift now to Mega. Mega, welcome to the panel. You belong to a new generation of chefs. I mean, you're nominated the best chef in India. So, in that generation, I mean, you represent the chefs who are committed to transforming sustainably sourced ingredients into healthy meals. You are in that business. Do you think that people in general understand the impacts of food on their health and on the planet's health? That's the first question. And what, if they're not totally aware, what can we do in this group to accelerate that awareness? So over to you for your insights, please.
So to answer your first question, I don't think that people know that their diet affects the health of the planet. And I feel that when you talk about climate change or when we talk about planetary health, everybody just thinks of coal, petroleum, electricity, and they just blame governments and blame people in power, but they don't realize that just by changing what they're putting on their plate, they can make a huge difference to the health of the planet. So I feel that this awareness needs to be created, and I feel that how we can create this awareness is that chefs need to be at the center of this, and chefs are the new celebrities. So how people will probably follow a movie star to see what they're wearing and where they're going. People are going to follow chefs to see what they're eating and what they're cooking, and they'll want to again do the same that the chefs that they look up to are cooking or eating or are promoting. So I feel that chefs really will play a huge impact in this conversation. And I think that restaurants need to champion sustainability on their menus. They need to. So if you are putting an okra, if you are putting a moringa dish on your menu, you can't just put it there and then expect your guests to figure out why it's there. You need to talk about its benefits for your body or about its benefits for the planet, and that's how a restaurant, a chef can create awareness. We can also run campaigns. That's what I did at my restaurant. I used to run campaigns every month, whether it was a Future 50 food campaign, whether it was a campaign to promote the biodiversity of my country, because I felt that people within my country did not know what all diverse produce is grown in my country itself. So I feel, and the kind of response that I got for these things from the younger generation made me realize that if you do give out the information, and if you do give out a reasoning for why you are running a particular campaign or why you are cooking a particular dish, there are takers and there are people who will adapt to your philosophy. I mean, I had guests calling me up asking me for recipes of some diverse ingredients and how they could cook it at home. So I think restaurants and chefs can play a huge impact.
Mega, there is one question that I hear a lot when we talk to chefs about repurposing their menus, because I agree chefs are the celebrities of the moment, and they say that they don't want to embrace, not all of them wants to embrace the sustainability movement because sustainable foods are boring. What do you think about that?
I feel that this is again a mental block that people have in their heads, that if a dish is called a healthy salad or if it's called a sustainable curry, people are not going to order it because they think that sustainable or healthy is equal to tasteless. So again, that's where chefs come into the picture. And as the chef's manifesto says in the manifesto, that when you're putting a sustainable or a healthy dish on your menu, do not call it that. Call it, give it a nice and attractive name, and then write in the description that it's healthy and it's sustainable. So I feel that the packaging really matters, and the way that you present that dish in terms of how it looks and in terms of how it's worded in your menu makes a very, very big impact. And what I used to do at my restaurant was I used to make sure that a chef goes to the table to take an order and not just a server or not just a front of the house person, because the way that a chef can explain a dish to your guests, a front of the house person will not be able to explain it with the same passion. And when I would go and explain dishes to my guests, and I would tell them that, okay, this is how it's made and this is what all goes in it and this is how it tastes, and oh, by the way, it's sustainable too, then it used to sell much more than someone just reading it on the menu that, oh, it's a sustainable dish, oh, forget it, we'll order something else. So yeah.
Mega, fascinated. Thank you very much. Let's shift the conversation now. I mean, from the table, from a chef, to more from the policy side. And I'll go back to Lawrence now. Lawrence, what else do you think needs to happen to shift diets towards healthy and sustainable foods?
Thank you, Zhao. I was listening to Meg and Lucy, fascinated by what they were saying. I'm nodding my head a lot to what Mega was saying. First thing we need to do to shift diets is stop being so left brain about food choices. You know, so think about this. One of the countries that GAIN has an office in, the government has a $3 million budget to change the way people think about nutrition, public campaign. One of the big multinationals in that same country has a $7 million advertising budget for just one product line. So completely outgunned and outspent. So the campaigning has to be smarter and stickier and more engaging. So that means instead of just saying, this food's good for you, therefore you should eat more of it, very similar to what Mega was saying, you have to figure out what people really care about, and then you have to link health and nutrition to that. And so that's the right brain part. That's the bit that's not so logical, that's not so data oriented. It's more about imagery and emotions and fantasy and aspirations and humor. That's what you have to tap into. So an example of that is a campaign in Bangladesh that we are running. We've got 500,000 adolescents signing up to a pledge. It's a Nourishing Dreams pledge. We said to adolescents in Bangladesh, working with our partners, what is it that you care about? What are your hopes for the future? And they said, well, we dream about becoming a teacher or a nurse or a pop star or a chef. So the word dream kept coming up over and over again. So we, working with our Bangladeshi partners, we said, let's link nutrition to this idea of dreams. So we set up a campaign called Nourishing Dreams. 500,000 adolescents have signed up to this pledge, and it's a pledge that they've said, we will spend more of our money, the little pocket money we get, the 10 cents a day, we will spend that on healthier food if you, the government, do X, Y, and Z, and you, businesses that are often found around our schools, do A, B, and C. Now, that's a very powerful way of changing demand and shifting demand, and then leveraging that, using that to leverage a supply response, both from government in terms of public procurement, what the government buys for its schools, but also from small businesses that provide food to those adolescents. So that was my long answer. My short answer is we need to get much more creative about how we build the demand for healthier food.
Thank you very much. I love the part about the Nourishing Dream Pledge. You know, this is so inspiring, really inspiring. I'm going to use that, the matter of incentives and disincentives, and go back to Lucy. Lucy, in your experience, what is going to help? What is needed for small producers to make shifts? What types of incentives and disincentives they need from where you stand? What barriers do they face that need to be corrected?
First, I think I like what Lawrence was speaking about and giving those examples. And when you look at the policy shifts and so on, I think it's very, very important to make sure that you talk to the communities themselves. You talk to the people on the ground, because that's where the main problem is in terms of understanding the process. So for example, for the pastoralists, especially the women whom we are trying to teach and have them produce food, it's first, the most important thing is the issue of land. As you know, indigenous people, pastoralists, and other nomadic people, the most tricky thing is normally the land. If they can have their land that they are assured that is our land, is very, very important, because then there they can be able to really hold on to that particular land and be able to do as many things as they could. Like, for example, now we can no longer, as I said earlier on, depend mainly on livestock alone. So we have to have these alternatives. Do they know how to prepare that to farm? No. They need to be trained and know how to farm different vegetables, different fruits, and so on. They are no longer the forests which they used to go out and graze and then collect wild fruits and wild vegetables. It's no longer there, because again, it goes back to land. Who owns that particular land? Who has the right to the land? So these are some of the key issues which are very crucial. At the same time, even though the women are the one who provide food and feed the world, for the pastoral communities, most of them don't own that land. That land is for the man, and that's the way the tradition sets up. And even though our constitution, to go back to policy, say that everyone has a right to that particular land, you can own the land if possible, you still have to go the traditional way of requesting to be able to do that. So there is that possibility that despite the fact that there are many different challenges that are facing the communities, may it be climate change or what, the production is very, very important. And as you ask, what can be done? Is a question again of going back to the ground, promoting the community agriculture officers who could go into the community and talk to the community and ask them and show them what they can plant, how to do it without using chemicals, but use their own organic way of farming. One of the other thing which is a big dynamic for the communities, sharing among each other is also very important. Talking to themselves and talking to their colleagues who have succeeded in one way or another is also something that is very important. But issues of diet are very, very important. And the question of trying to make sure that they understand is one of the biggest challenge we have, for them to have the rights to be able to speak for themselves and select and know and be able to know this is what we have. The other biggest problem is that these communities are also in remote areas. And most of the time, everything else that happens in nearer to the tarmac, where you have major towns where people can be easily access the communities and so on. So that's also a big challenge, but at least that we have quite a number of NGOs and other partners who go into the community to be able to help them that. But if only our governments could listen, it would be great to have to go to those communities and try to make them understand how to plant quite different variety of food that can make their nutrition better. And I think this example we had from Lawrence would be very good to be able to work, the government working together with the communities as early as school and continue to the community level.
Shall,
So,
can I come
Lucy,
in?
sure, please do. Please do. Please do.
Lucy, thanks. One of the things we notice in the places where we work, in the countries we work in, you see the prices of fruits, vegetables, eggs, dairy, they're actually going up.
Yes.
And that's not so great for the consumers, but you think it would be good for the supply response. You think that's a market opportunity, and there's an opportunity for farmers and others to respond to that. But there is no supply response, and part of our guess is that's because the small and medium enterprises in the middle of the food chains, the ones that are connecting the smallholder farmers with the consumers, they're not sufficiently supported by governments and the finance institutions. Finance for them is too expensive from the formal banks, and they don't quite qualify for microfinance. So they're somewhere in the middle, and we feel like if we can give them more support, especially the ones that are led by women, they would do a much better job of connecting the consumer and the demand that's there for healthy food with the production capacity that surely is there for healthy food. Does any of that resonate with you and your colleagues?
Yes, it does very much. And sorry.
No, please continue. I'll speak after you.
I think that's it does a lot. It does a lot. And one of the key issues that even when we discuss here is also to look at the economy of these communities. How are they able to really buy that food, purchase, as you've said? And is that food available? Even the smallest, the vegetables, are they available? Are they able to buy them and be able to consume them? It's not like but we have, as we say, we have the pastoralists who are totally zero in terms of looking at farming, but we already, as organizations working with those communities, started with them from the kitchen garden. We call it the kitchen garden. Start from there so that you can be able to plant and know these vegetables and move on slowly by slowly. But as you say very clearly, what is happening in other parts is the same thing for the small holders to be able to get some support and improve their production. right now with the COVID-19, we cannot escape talking about that. It's such a hard time for everyone. And most of even those who had gone a step ahead can no longer go because they don't have any support. They don't have any small loans they can go and get and then be able to improve what they have. So that's what I can try to say, but it's right there. It's part of it. And we do understand it and really appreciate what the others are doing.
Thank you, Lucy and Lawrence, for that question. Megha, why don't you tell us what happens in India? How can how can chefs work to empower women, given the role that women play in Indian agriculture?
So in India, we are a majority of our population comes from farming families or families that whose main source of income is farming. But in these rural areas, the men and the women both do the farming. But as far as the interaction with the people who are buying the produce, or how the money has to be managed, or where the produce has to be sent, is a very male dominated area. Because in the rural areas, the women just talk to the family, and they don't talk to third parties apart from their relatives. And as far as women in even in a professional setup, like women chefs, is very less in India, which is changing now, because the timing in the hospitality industry is very, very, very long timings. You'll have to work late nights, have to work on weekends. So even getting women into the kitchen is a task. So it's slowly changing now. But I feel that as chefs, so we can really support women farmers, because if women farmers know that the chef who is buying their produce, or the chef who they will be interacting with is also a woman, then they'll feel more comfortable in interacting. So even if the head chef is not a woman, but there is a woman in the kitchen, I would suggest that use that woman chef to talk to your woman farmer, so at least the woman farmer has a voice, and she is also able to convey what she is growing and what she wants to do with the produce. And as far as the kitchen is concerned, it's a task to have women in the kitchen, because there's very less family support. So a lot of women drop out of this profession very early in their career if they don't have family support. And I'm very proud to say that my kitchen had a majority of women over men. So yes, I feel that women can empower women together.
Yeah.
Wonderful, Megha. I know that Lawrence has a question that he wants to ask you. So Lawrence, over to you.
Thank you, Zhao. Megha, one of the criticisms that we come up against in our work is that, well, you guys are working through markets to try to improve nutrition and try to improve the affordability of safe and nutritious foods, and maybe you can get to the bottom 20%, but you can't get to the bottom 10%. Or maybe you can get to the bottom 40%, the poorest 40%, but you can't get to the bottom 20%. And our response is always, sometimes that's true, sometimes it's not. But even when it is true, we're setting aspirations, we're setting norms that cascade down and change the way people think about food, even if they can't actually act on it at that point in time, if they don't have the income. And I wondered if you face the same challenges, because I imagine the people that eat in the restaurants that you operate are not the poorest of the poor. Do you see the aspirations that you set in your restaurants and the norms that you set, do you see them being picked up by poorer families and poorer households?
You know, ironically, it's the poorest people in India who eat the most sustainable meals. It's the poorest people in India who eat local, who eat sustainable, who eat stuff grown in their kitchen gardens, who eat seasonally, and who don't waste, because food is is so precious to them that they will end up using every part of their vegetable or every part. So what I am trying to popularize in my restaurant, what I am asking the educated people or the well-to-do people to imbibe, is the philosophy that is already being followed in the ruralist and the poorest of poor areas in India. And I'm actually looking at them for inspiration. So in fact, even on my menu, the most sustainable dishes are those which my dishwasher, who's come from a remote village, I used to eat with his lunch, and I would ask him, "What are you making? What are you eating? I haven't seen this in the staff meal today." And he would say, "No, we make this in my village." And when I would eat those things, I would end up putting them on my menu because they were seasonal, local, healthy, sustainable, good for us, good for the planet. So I feel we need to look at the
Right.
extreme
Love
rural
it.
population in India.
Good.
Mega,
Thank you.
I've got a follow-up question if we have time.
Please do. Go ahead, Brent.
You know, when we're talking about a shift towards healthy, sustainable diets, we don't have very many good examples of countries that are doing it. And what do you think India can offer to the world in terms of an example of potential dietary shifts? Like what is and what isn't working from your perspective?
I feel that India needs to stop aping the West. We're too fascinated by the West, and we need to see that the West is actually looking at us, whether it's turmeric milk or whether it is our spices or whether it's our ancient grains. We have so much history and heritage, culinary history and culinary heritage to be proud of. That if we start taking pride on the ingredients that in our own kitchen or that grow in our own country, we'll really be leading the sustainability movement, is what I feel. And I also feel that India is the land of Ayurveda. I mean, it is our we have spices and concoctions of different herbs that end up curing any disease possible because of our knowledge of Ayurveda. Secondly, I feel that we're predominantly a vegetarian country, which is why and even the non-vegetarians, they'll eat more of seafood and maybe chicken, but red meat is not such a popular meat in our country. So we again our carbon footprint over there is very less as compared to other countries. In fact, in the world ranking of vegetarian or plant-based eating countries, India ranks second after Bangladesh. So I feel we're leading there as well, and we're very lucky to be blessed with a very, very vast and diverse landscape. Which is why when we say that we'll eat local, it doesn't necessarily mean that we'll end up depriving ourselves of anything, because we have a vast coastline, we have mountains, we have a huge desert area, we have a plateau area. We can get all the produce that we need from within our own country, and I feel that India can really lead in all of these areas. We just need to start looking inwards, and we need to start being proud of our culinary heritage. I feel that somewhere that pride is missing.
Megan, thank you so much. Everybody at this stage, each panelist had at least 2 questions, but Brent had only 1, and we're not going to let the scientist off the hook. So, Megan, why don't you ask Brent a really tough question before we open to Q&A from the public, from the audience? Thank you, Megan.
My question is that as a chef, when I talk about plant-based eating or when I talk about being vegetarian and its benefits for the planet or for our health, I get a lot of questions that the normal population or the normal people ask me, that if all of us switch to being to plant-based eating, or if all of us switch to being vegetarian, what is going to happen to the livelihood of the millions of people whose livelihood depends on the farming or the meat business, basically, who are and the second thing is that will it disbalance the food chain if more people switch to plant-based eating? What are we going to do with all of the excess that is going to be left with us? That will it end up disbalancing the food chain?
Thanks, Megan. Brent, over to you.
Well, that's a very easy question to answer. You know, when we published the Eat Lancet last year, one of the misconceptions of it was that we were promoting, or we were saying every single person on this planet should be vegetarian, should become vegan. And that was not the message of the Eat Lancet report. And when you look at a healthy diet, we're saying people can and should still eat meat, up to 5-6 servings of meat per week. So, some red meat, some white meat, some fish. So in no way are we saying that everybody should ever become vegan or vegetarian. That is up to that is your choice. And I don't think it's a feasible option to expect that everybody would. Now, when we're looking at this global dietary shift towards more plant-based diet, we do have to look at which production systems are the most sustainable. And there are ways of producing meat out there that are more sustainable than others. There are some pastoral communities where putting livestock onto the soil actually is good for carbon sequestration. It's good for storing carbon in the ground. It's good for biodiversity. And the meat that we do have to make on this planet, produce on this planet, we should find those production systems wherever they are, produce it on that, shift away from the production systems that are not good for the planet. And if we do that, we can actually do both. We can actually shift towards more healthy plant-based diet. We can nurture the soil, we can save biodiversity, and it doesn't have to be an either or.
Mhm.
Brent, thank you very much. I have a very excited crowd that wants to ask questions to you. So here are some. The first one, and I'll direct them to different panel members, or you can choose to answer them. One of them is that it's about the meat. And the question is, how do we account for the true cost of meat? The cost of meat isn't reflecting externalities. So who would like to answer that? Perhaps Lawrence, would you be keen to take that question?
Mm-hmm.
You're muted.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think we know about the externalities, the health externalities and the environmental externalities. And actually every kind of food has an externality that's not captured. Some types of vegetables use a lot of water and a lot of energy, and that's not captured. So the question is, and we can calculate all of those prices. The question is, how on earth do we implement it? I think that's the difficult question. And inevitably it will mean that the food is more expensive. So again, because that's the true cost of it. So again, who's going to bear that cost and how do we implement it? And I don't know the answer to that. It's essentially a political question.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you very much, Lawrence. Mega, there is one for you here, and this is the question. What's the role of meat substitutes or lab-grown meats in the transition towards more plant-based diets? So would you serve lab-grown meat in your restaurant? What does it mean for you?
No, I wouldn't, because in India, it just doesn't work. Because the moment you say it's lab-grown meat, Indians are going to have an aversion to it. So I'm just speaking specific to my country. And because we're a predominantly vegetarian country, we have so many vegetarian dishes and vegetarian ingredients, be it jackfruit, be it hemp, potato, sweet potato, corn, okra, lentils, we're the land of lentils. So I would not champion or even put a lab-grown meat on my menu, because I have tried it. I did try to put it on my menu, and the response that I got from vegetarians was, if I wanted to eat lab-grown meat, I would just eat normal meat because it would be fresher and more healthy. And I don't know why people have this notion that it's not healthy. In India, people have this notion, but there's just too much biodiversity to play around with and to create alternatives for meat. And that's what I do in my restaurant.
Thank you.
I mean, I think like anytime we're looking at some source of meat, and there's a current movement towards more plant-based burgers, beyond burgers, lab-grown meat, we need to think about not only the environmental impacts, but also the health impacts. And if we are producing lab-grown meat, we might be lowering environmental impacts, but if the health impacts remain high, then it's not worth it. So whether it's lab-grown, grown on a lush native prairie, we need to be figuring out what is the most healthy, sustainable alternative. When we put those two together, that's going to help our decision-making.
Yes.
And I think it's also good to note that, for example, in country like Kenya, we have seen that a lot of meat is consumed in the cities and in towns. And in the rural area, they cannot afford to keep on eating meat every other time. And that's why we say we have to think hard on alternatives that can also be able to help the communities on the ground. Things like beans and trying to get those vegetables is something that everybody's going on. And some of the communities are also rearing chicken because they find it a bit more easier to get that than to slaughter a goat or a cow for the family. That is no longer really economical. So there are alternatives that are there that can be possibly be adapted very easily by the communities. But the big centers, the consumption of meat like in Nairobi is really high, even though it's expensive.
Lucy, there is one question that hinges on that, and I think you can take that one, is that the question is as follows. We talked about affordability of fruit and vegetables for the poor, but it's also unaffordable for poorer people in urban areas. It can be in Germany, it can be anywhere. How do we make it more affordable for these people, for the poor?
It's very true. And what we did for ourselves is to start to tell the communities to plant these fruits in their own homes, in their own, even at the kitchen garden. They can still put like passion fruit around the fence and just make things work out. I have seen in Nairobi also in some centers, in some places, there are people who can even plant just one pawpaw somewhere there. There are other places you can find that somebody has put some trees, but one of the trees in there is probably an avocado tree or something else. So like even in my estate here, I could see small fruits, small little fruits like a guava and so on, which is just small that can be able to fit somewhere. It's very true. They cannot afford those fruits. Even people in the urban centers and in the, in other places, it's very, very expensive to be able to buy that. But those in the rural areas, there are some ways that they try as much as possible. And that's what we promote for the women. Plant trees, but one of it or two must be a fruit tree.
Very good.
Just to build on that, I think affordability is one of the most important things out there. And when we go into a supermarket, often we're driven by how much it costs. And right now, coming back to the true, like what the true cost of an actual food is, I think is very important, and we have to consider it. I think that when we go into a supermarket next time, if we're debating between, that fruit or a bag of potato chips, and if that bag of potato chips was priced at $10 or $15, but the fruit was 10 cents, that might drive our decision in terms of which one to choose. And right now, it's the other way around. And therefore, unfortunately, some individuals are in some cases forced to make decisions that are driven by what it costs.
Yeah.
And I also heard a very interesting quote at the Eat Forum last year, where someone said that you need to question why, don't question why real food is more expensive, question why the junk food is so cheap. So that kind of really stayed with me.
But to add to what Megan, in some of the hotels, I see even in Kenya and other places, because of the fruits that is not affordable easily, we find that in some of the restaurants they serve and then they give a fruit. And you'll see that in most of those fruits as a complimentary, you find that many people will frequent there because they'll have something alternative like a banana or a slice of pawpaw or something like that. And I think these are things that we need to focus and see how chefs like you can be also able to promote such initiatives.
Zhao, can I make a quick comment?
Please do.
So we've been talking a lot about individual consumers, and individual consumers can make choices that have profound impacts on hunger, livelihood, health, planetary health, animal health. But governments are huge consumers and huge purchasers of food. Public procurement is very powerful. Some governments will buy a quarter of all the food that's produced. And the dietary guidelines that Brent was talking about earlier, and you mentioned, Zhao, are very important to guide individual consumption, but they're not very well, governments don't pay much attention to them. And I think I'd love to see all the activists and the NGOs and anyone who cares about dietary health, I'd like to see government scorecards that say, how well do governments comply by their own dietary guidelines? And I bet we'll find that they don't do very well in terms of their climate policy, their trade policy, their security policy, their agriculture policy. I bet they don't do very well. And I think that's very, very important. Governments play a big role in many countries in purchasing and in setting norms. And it's not just influencing what consumers do, it's showing them what could be done.
This is wonderful, Lawrence. In fact, I know Brent is conducting research on that same topic. So Brent, let share one very quick remark, because we do need to close the session, unfortunately.
Yeah, so we're looking just at that, Lawrence, in 144 countries globally, and we'll be publishing that work in October, really looking at the relationship between national dietary guidelines, current consumption patterns, and environmental impacts, whether it's water use, biodiversity use, land use, and others. So that will be coming out in October.
You need to look at what governments are doing in response to those guidelines as well. Maybe a later paper.
Yep, absolutely.
Everyone, I am delighted. I could carry on this conversation for the entire day or more, including dinner at Mega's restaurant if we could, but we have to close the session. I will not wrap it up because I decided to keep the conversation going. It was fascinating to hear from all of you, to learn from all of you. I hope that everybody in the Whova platform enjoyed this session. There is a lot more. The only thought that I would like to leave with the entire group is that the power is in our plates. What you put on it matters for nature and for people. So with that, I thank you very, very much for your thoughtful comments from the audience and for the delightful conversation we had here. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Bye.